On a January night in 1945, a ship went down in the Baltic Sea carrying something close to 10,000 people. Somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 of them died in under an hour. Perhaps half of those were children. It is, by a considerable margin, the deadliest sinking in the history of the sea. It killed 4 to 6 times as many people as the Titanic, and I would wager that until this moment you had never heard its name. This is not a mystery. Nothing about it is unsolved. There was no cover-up, no conspiracy, no lost expedition sent to find it. The Wilhelm Gustloff disappeared from memory for a far simpler and far more uncomfortable reason. For 50 years, nobody on either side of the war particularly wanted to talk about it. Tonight, we open that file. She was launched in May of 1937 at the Blohm and Voss yard in Hamburg. 25,000 tons, 684 feet, gleaming white. And she was not built to make money. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the flagship of a state leisure program called Strength Through Joy, an arm of the Nazi regime designed to give ordinary German workers something no ordinary German worker had ever had: a sea cruise. Her cleverest feature was not her ballroom or her swimming pool. It was that every single cabin aboard was identical. There was no first class. There was no steerage. A factory hand and a party official slept in the same room, ate the same food, and looked out of the same window at the same sea. She was a floating argument, and the argument was this: look what we have given you. In 18 months, she carried more than 80,000 people on 60 voyages. She was, in every sense that mattered, the most persuasive piece of propaganda the regime ever put to sea. Hold on to that, because it becomes the problem. The thing that made this ship famous is precisely the thing that would later make what happened to her impossible to talk about. In September of 1939, the argument ended because the war began. The Gustloff's holiday voyages ceased immediately and were never resumed. She was repainted as a hospital ship and served as one for 14 months. And then, in November of 1940, she was stripped of that role, moved to the port of Gotenhafen on the Baltic coast, and moored to a pier, where she would remain, without moving, for the next 4 years. For those 4 years, she was not really a ship at all. She was a building that happened to float, a barracks for roughly 1,000 submarine trainees, her engines cold, her hull growing foul beneath the waterline, snow gathering on her boat deck each winter and melting off it each spring. The most traveled vessel in the German merchant fleet sat perfectly still while the war moved past her. And then, in the last winter of that war, someone decided she should sail again. By the middle of January 1945, the Eastern Front was no longer a front. Soviet armies had broken deep into East Prussia, and the German civilian population there, some of it having lived on that land for centuries, began to move west in the dead of one of the coldest winters on record. They moved on foot, in farm carts, along frozen roads, through blizzards, under air attack, toward the only direction still open to them, the sea. By mid-January, something like 100,000 people had accumulated in the Baltic ports, waiting for a ship. Any ship. What followed was the largest seaborne evacuation in history, larger than Dunkirk by a wide margin, though you will hear it discussed a great deal less. It was called Operation Hannibal, and over the following 4 months, it would carry more than 2 million people west across the Baltic. Every hull that could float was called into it, which is how a stationary barracks ship, 4 years out of service, came to be ordered to sea. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been designed to carry 1,465 passengers and 417 crew. On the 30th of January 1945, her official manifest recorded 6,050 souls aboard. The manifest was not close to correct. People were still coming up the gangways as she prepared to sail. Others were lifted aboard from small boats after she had cast off. The most rigorous reconstruction of that day, by the German researcher Heinz Schön, himself a survivor of the sinking, put the true figure at roughly 10,582, more than 5 times the number she had been built to hold. Of those, some 8,900 were civilians, 918 were military personnel, 373 were young women of the Naval Auxiliary, 162 were wounded soldiers, and somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 of the people aboard that ship were children. Now, 2 things must be said here plainly, and neither one is permitted to cancel the other. The Wilhelm Gustloff mounted anti-aircraft guns. She carried roughly 1,000 naval personnel. She was not painted as a hospital ship, she was not sailing under any protected status, and she was not marked as carrying refugees. By the laws of war as they stood in 1945, she was a legitimate military target, and the charge that sinking her was a crime has never been made to hold. That is the first thing. The second is that she was, that night, mostly full of children. Both of these are true. Hold on to both. She sailed at 12:30 in the afternoon. The conditions that night were, in the most literal sense, lethal before anything else happened. The air between 10 and 18 degrees below zero, the sea itself at about 4 degrees above freezing, ice floes moving on the surface. Her captains, and there were several aboard, disagreeing with one another about how to proceed, settled on a course in deep water, and then made a decision that has been argued over ever since. Fearing a collision with an oncoming minesweeper convoy, they switched on the ship's navigation lights. In the middle of a war, in hostile water, the Wilhelm Gustloff sailed lit. Some miles off, the Soviet submarine S-13 was on patrol under a 32-year-old captain named Alexander Marinesko, a gifted submariner, and at that particular moment, a man in serious trouble ashore, facing disciplinary proceedings over an episode of drinking and absence before the patrol began. He needed a result. What he saw through his periscope was a very large, darkened transport running with lights, escorted in a war zone. He did not know what was inside her. He could not have known. He maneuvered to the shoreward side, where nobody was watching, and at around 9 o'clock in the evening, he fired 4 torpedoes. 3 of the 4 found her, all on the port side. The first struck the bow. The second struck amidships, into the drained swimming pool, where the 373 young women of the Naval Auxiliary had been quartered. Of those 373, 3 survived. The third disabled the engine room, and with it the power, the pumps, and the lights. She began to list to port almost immediately, and the list was the thing that killed her. The lifeboats on the high starboard side, as they were lowered, swung inward and struck the ship's own tilting hull. The davits were frozen. Many of the boats could not be released at all. She went down by the bow in something under an hour. Most of the people who died that night did not drown. At 4 degrees, the sea does not need to drown anyone. It simply takes the heat out of a body, and it takes it quickly. German warships turned back into the dark and worked the water for hours. 2 torpedo boats, the T-36 and the Löwe, took more than 1,000 people out between them. Minesweepers, a steamer, and a handful of small craft found the rest, 1 and 2 at a time. In total, 1,252 people came out of that water alive. The rest, roughly 9,000 and possibly more, did not. Sources genuinely differ on the number, and they always will. The reconstruction that gives us the highest figure comes from a man who was aboard. But even the most conservative estimate leaves the Wilhelm Gustloff as the deadliest sinking in the history of the sea, and it is not close. Alexander Marinesko had just carried out the most lethal attack in the history of submarine warfare. He received no hero's welcome. The disciplinary matter waiting for him ashore proceeded regardless. Within the year, he was court-martialed over his conduct before the patrol, demoted and dishonorably discharged. He worked afterward in obscurity. He was quietly reinstated to his rank in 1960, and in 1963, he was finally given the ceremony traditionally owed to a submarine commander returning from a successful patrol. 18 years late. He died of cancer 3 weeks afterward. In 1990, 27 years after his death, he was named a hero of the Soviet Union. And that brings us to the question this file really turns on. Not how 9,000 people died. That part is unfortunately straightforward. The question is how a disaster of that magnitude vanished. The answer is that it fell into the gap between two silences. In Germany, after the war, to speak of German suffering was to invite a very reasonable question about what Germany had just done to everybody else. And so, for decades, the subject carried a stigma that most people simply chose not to shoulder. And in the Soviet Union, the sinking's commander was a disgraced officer. There was little appetite for celebrating the triumph of a man who had been thrown out of the Navy. Neither side wanted the story, so there was no story. The largest maritime disaster in human history sat in that gap for 50 years. She lies today about 19 nautical miles off the Polish coast near Leba, in 44 meters of water, broken and settled into the seabed. She is classified as a war grave. A 500-meter exclusion zone surrounds her, within which it is forbidden to dive, to anchor, or to fish. Which is to say that the deadliest shipwreck in the history of the world is not a site anyone is permitted to visit. She is simply left alone down there, in the dark and the cold, with everyone still aboard her. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built to be looked at. That was her entire purpose. A gleaming white argument, sailed around the North Sea to persuade ordinary people that the regime which built her had their interests at heart. She spent 18 months being admired, 4 years tied to a pier, and 1 afternoon at sea. She was a legitimate target, carrying soldiers and guns. She was also the largest grave the sea has ever taken, and most of what she took was children. Those two sentences sit badly beside one another, and they are both entirely true. And the century that produced them is full of pairs exactly like that. The ship that was made to be seen went down in the dark, and then the world agreed for 50 years not to look.